Montana Territory, April 1883. The wind came sharp off the Bitterroot Mountains that morning, cold enough to chap lips and bite through wool, but it was the laughter that stung worse. "Faye Weller's got a foot in the grave already," one of the boys hollered, too loud outside the chapel schoolhouse. Faye kept her chin high even as her uneven steps dragged through fresh spring mud. Her right leg, twisted from a childhood fever, lagged behind her left with every step. The mockery trailed her like a shadow, the snickers of girls and boys who had once played jacks with her under cottonwoods. Now they watched her limp and whispered like she was something broken. That afternoon, her aunt packed her things into a carpet bag and handed her a small coin pouch. "You'll go to Cold Creek," Aunt Mabel said, not unkindly but distant, like she had already made peace with it. "My cousin there has a room above the dry goods store. Maybe you can be useful." Faye did not cry. She just nodded, her jaw set tight. She had learned long ago that tears never changed anything. The stagecoach ride to Cold Creek was long and rough, and the driver barely offered a hand as she struggled to climb down. The town was a mining and ranching crease in the land, small and dusty, with only one main street and a few scattered homes along the valley floor. Her world was shrinking, and not for the first time. The dry goods store smelled of flour and saddle oil. Upstairs, the room was small but clean. She slept that night with her hands folded over her stomach, staring at the ceiling, feeling like someone had torn out a chapter from her life and left her with blank pages. The next morning, she started sweeping floors and stocking shelves. No one said much to her, and she did not say much back. 3 days later, he walked in. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a dust-coated coat and eyes the color of creekstone. He had a week's worth of trail on his boots and a quiet way about him, like he had seen too much and spoken little of it. He bought coffee, nails, and a new bridle, and as he turned to leave, his gaze caught hers. She looked away first. The next time he came in, it was raining. His hat dripped by the door, and his voice was a low rumble. "You got any of that sweet tobacco my ranch hand's always chewing?" he asked, eyes flicking toward her with a faint curiosity. Faye glanced at the high shelf where the tobacco tin sat. Her limp made ladders slow going, but she went for it anyway, dragging the wooden stool across the floor with a thunk. "I can get it," she said, already climbing. He stepped forward. "It's all right. I can reach." "I said I got it." She reached, teeth clenched, and grabbed the tin with her fingertips. As she came down, her foot slipped on the last rung. She braced for the fall but landed against a strong chest instead. His hands steadied her, gentle but certain. "You all right?" he asked, not letting go until she nodded. She stepped back, face burning.
"Fine."
"Just slipped." He nodded once and paid, but paused at the door. "I'm Sawyer Oakes," he said, tipping his hat. "Ranch is west of here, by the foothills." She did not answer. He left anyway. Over the next weeks, he came more often. Sometimes for supplies, sometimes just for a moment's quiet. Faye kept her distance, though she noticed how he always looked her in the eye. Never at her limp. One afternoon, she found a small bag of licorice on the counter with a note. "For the girl who climbs ladders better than most men ride horses." No name. But she recognized the handwriting from one of his receipts. Later that week, she was walking back from the post office when the rain came down sudden and hard. Her limp slowed her, and the mud pulled at her skirts. She slipped again this time. There was no one to catch her. Until hooves stopped nearby. Sawyer dismounted in one smooth motion and reached down without hesitation. "I am not helpless," she snapped, wiping at her skirts. "I never said you were," he said calmly, holding out his hand. She glared at it, then at him. But the rain was getting colder, and her ankle throbbed. She took his hand. He helped her up onto his horse, climbed up behind her, and they rode in silence. His coat wrapped around her shoulders, warm and smelling faintly of leather and smoke. When they reached the boarding house, she hesitated before slipping off the saddle. He held her steady. "You do not have to be proud with me," he said softly. "You walk with a limp." "So what?" She looked at him, then really looked. "No one ever says it like that," she whispered. "I say what I mean." From that day on, he started showing up not just at the store, but outside her steps, offering rides to the edge of town, or just quiet company under the sycamore near the creek. He brought her wildflowers, once dusty bluebells, and prairie stars in a tin cup. "You do not have to bring me things," she said, though her voice softened. "I know. I want to." One night, she told him about the fever that ruined her leg, about the children who laughed, and the family who sent her away. He listened without interrupting, his hand resting near hers on the porch rail. "I thought if I moved far enough from where I came from," she said, "maybe I could stop feeling like something left behind." He turned to her then. "You are not left behind. You are just not where you belong yet." She looked at him, heart stuttering. "And where is that?" she asked. "With someone who sees you for what you are, not what you are not." She did not answer, but she did not pull her hand away when his fingers brushed hers. Weeks passed, and the town began to notice. A few whispered, some stared, but Sawyer never flinched. He walked beside her slowly, always matching her pace through town, through the fields, through the long, quiet hours of evening. One Sunday, as they sat by the riverbank, she turned to him. "Why do you keep showing up?" He looked at her like it was the simplest question in the world. "Because you matter to me, Faye. And I want you to know that no one's ever going to laugh at you again, not while I am around." Her breath caught. "That is not a small promise." "I do not make small promises." She smiled then, the first real one in a long time. And he smiled back. That night, as they walked the path back to town, her limp slower than usual from the long day, he stopped. "Faye!" "Yes." He turned fully toward her. "You will walk beside me forever, if you will have me." She stared at him, heart thudding. "Why me?" she asked, voice shaking. "Because you are brave, and stubborn, and kind, and because I do not care how you walk, only that you walk with me." Tears filled her eyes, but she laughed through them. "Then yes, Sawyer Oakes. I will." He kissed her right there under the stars, and the world felt big again, not wide and cold, but full of something warm and waiting. Sawyer brought her to the ranch in late May. Once the snow melt had cleared the high trails and the grass was thickening along the ridgelines. The land was open here, breathing under wide skies, the kind that made a person feel both small and steadied. He had two hands working the place, a Paiute man named Elias who rarely spoke but had a sharp eye for cattle, and a younger fellow from Arkansas called Theo, who played fiddle when his chores were done and whistled through most of them. Faye stood at the edge of the yard the first morning, her boot soles damp from dew, watching the cattle shift in their pens and the wind move through the cottonwoods by the creek. The air smelled of juniper and horsehair, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel set apart from something. She just felt here. "I can work," she said, turning to Sawyer as he saddled his mare. "I'm not going to sit inside and wait for you to come back." He nodded. "Didn't think you would." She started in the garden. The soil was stubborn, full of stone and clay, but her hands knew how to coax life from it. She tied her skirts up at the knee and dug trenches with a rusted spade, planting onions and beans in the same careful rhythm she'd learned from her grandmother before sickness took her. Theo offered to help once, but she waved him off. "Not because I'm proud," she told him, wiping sweat from her brow. "Just because I like to do things my own way." He tipped his hat and left her to it. Each day, Sawyer rose early to ride the fence lines and check the herd, and each evening he came back with dust on his coat and something quiet in his eyes that never turned heavy when they met hers. He listened when she spoke of the soil, of the first green shoots, of the hawks nesting in the rocky bluff nearby. She listened when he spoke of calving, of late frosts, of the way elk moved through the pass in early dawn. One night near the end of June, they supped on cornbread and dried venison, and he leaned back in his chair, watching the firelight catch in her hair. "You ever think about where you'd be if things had gone different?" he asked. Faye set her tin plate aside and drew her knees up to her chest on the porch step. "I used to," she said. "Used to think about what I lost. Now I think more about what's here." He reached over and laced his fingers through hers. "That's a better way." The next week, they drove a small group of cattle to a neighbor's pasture 3 miles off, and Faye rode beside him on a gelding named Jasper, her limp less noticeable in the saddle. She wore a borrowed hat and kept her eyes on the dirt trail, careful not to let her horse crowd his. "You ride like you were born to it," Sawyer said over the wind. "I wasn't," Faye replied. "But I learned. Had to." He didn't push further. He never did. That night, camped beneath a stretch of pines, she sat close to the fire and let her fingers trail through the coarse wool of his blanket. The stars were sharp above them, the kind that didn't blink or fade, and something about the quiet made words come easier. "I never expected to live like this," she said. Not in a home that wasn't just walls and a roof, but one with something steady inside it. Sawyer stirred the coals with a stick, then looked up. "I didn't expect to find someone who made the place feel full." They didn't say more after that, but when he lay down beside her, he curled an arm around her waist without asking, and she pressed her back into him like it was the most natural thing in the world. In July, a letter came from her aunt. Faye read it once, folded it flat, and tucked it into the edge of a trunk she didn't open often. She didn't tell Sawyer what it said. She didn't have to. He built her a bench near the creek, smooth-fitted from pine, and ran his hand along the edge when he was done. "Figured you'd want a place to watch the water," he said. "I do," she said, sitting down beside him. They watched it together, the current slow and clear, minnows darting in the shadows of stone. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked suddenly. He shook his head. "I've been enough places. I want to stay where something grows." They sat in silence after that, her head resting against his shoulder, the sun warm on their boots. Later that week, the three of them, Sawyer, Faye, and Theo, spent a day cutting hay in the meadow. Faye tied a kerchief around her neck and raked the windrows while Sawyer stacked and hauled. They worked without fuss, pausing only for sips of creek water and a shared lunch of dried apples and biscuits. That evening, Theo pulled out his fiddle and played a tune soft enough not to disturb the barn swallows. Faye stood in the barn doorway, swaying slightly, and Sawyer crossed the space between them. "Dance with me," he said quietly. "I don't dance," she answered, not meeting his eyes. "You do now." He held her carefully, one hand at her waist, the other guiding hers. Her steps were uneven, but he matched them without falter, moving slow, steady. Just the two of them beneath the rafters, the music threading through the dusk like something half-remembered. When the song ended, she stayed close, her palm against his chest. "You're not afraid of the way I move," she said. "No," he answered. "I see how far you've come." And she believed him. The garden bloomed strong by August, thick with tomatoes and beans, and Faye brought in baskets full, her hands rough but content. Sawyer fixed a second shelf in the pantry for her preserves, and she lined them up in neat rows, each jar a kind of promise. One morning, as the sun lit the barn roof in gold, Sawyer stepped in from the yard, brushing hay from his arms. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About building a second room onto the house. One with a real bed and space for more than just us." Faye looked at him, the pitchfork still in her hands. "You mean?" "I mean I'd marry you, if you'd have me." She set the fork down and walked to him, slow and sure. "I would," she said, voice steady. "I already do." They stood like that for a long time, the morning quiet around them, the future unfolding not in thunder or grand declarations, but with a warmth earned one day at a time. The wedding was quiet, held in the shade of the cottonwoods behind the house, with only Elias, Theo, and the preacher from Cold Creek standing witness. Faye wore a dress she'd sewn herself from unbleached muslin and lace salvaged from a forgotten trunk. Her hair was braided back with a sprig of sage tucked behind her ear. Sawyer hadn't shaved, and his shirt had a stubborn stain at the cuff he hadn't managed to scrub out, but he looked at her like she was the first sunrise he'd ever seen. After the vows, Theo played a tune low and slow while Elias poured coffee from a dented kettle. Faye and Sawyer sat on the porch steps, knees brushing, hands clasped loosely between them. "You nervous?" he asked, voice just above a whisper.
"No," she said.
"I've already done all my fearing. What's left now is just life." That night, they lay in the new room he'd built with his own hands. The walls still smelled of fresh-cut pine, and the window looked out toward the bluff where the hawks nested. She rested her head on his chest, tracing the curve of his collarbone with her thumb. "I don't feel like I'm waiting anymore," she said. "You're not," he answered. "We're already where we're going." By mid-autumn, the mornings came cold and silver. Faye rose early to tend the root cellar, wrapping onions and stacking jars with a kind of reverence. Sawyer spent long days riding the western boundary, where cougars had been nosing too near the calves. On one such morning, she waited longer than usual, standing at the edge of the yard as the wind stirred the dry grass. When he did return, loping in with a torn sleeve and a fresh scrape along his jaw, she didn't scold. She just took the reins from his hand and led the horse to water. "Big cat," he said. "Didn't get close, but it's out there." "Anything left behind?" "Tracks. Nothing more." They didn't speak again until supper, when he passed her the salt and their fingers touched. "You ever miss the town?" he asked. "No," she said, not looking up. "There's nothing there I'd trade for this." In November, they rode together to a neighbor's place 3 valleys over. Faye carried a satchel of dried herbs and salves, offerings for a woman expecting her 4th child. The trail was narrow, marked by shale and sagebrush, and her mare stumbled once on a loose stone. She caught herself quickly, but Sawyer's hand reached out all the same. "I'm fine," she said. "I know," he answered, not pulling back right away. On the return journey, they stopped by a frozen creek and shared a strip of jerky and a tin of boiled coffee. She watched the ice form in thin sheets over the rocks, the water underneath still shifting, never quite still. "I never asked you what you dreamed of," she said after a while. "Didn't have much time for dreaming. Try it now." He leaned back against a boulder, arms folded behind his head. "Land that holds, a roof that doesn't leak, and someone beside me who doesn't flinch when the wind howls." She reached out, brushing a pine needle from his sleeve. "That's not dreaming. That's just seeing clear." He looked over, eyes steady. "Then I guess you were the dream." "I just didn't know your name yet." Snow came early that year. Not heavy, but enough to hush the land. Faye spent hours at the hearth, mending coats and boiling soup bones down to rich broth. Sawyer carved a cradle from leftover spruce, sanding each curve smooth with the same care he gave the fence posts. One night, as they lay beneath the quilt she'd pieced from old shirts and flour sacks, he spoke into the dark. "I've been thinking about what we build next." Her fingers paused on his arm. "Something beyond the cattle? Beyond both of us. Something small, maybe. But ours." She didn't answer right away. Then, softly, "I've wondered what it would be like to raise something that comes from both." He turned to her fully. "Would you want that?" "I think I would." By the time the last of the frost lifted from the garden rows, she knew. She hadn't told him yet, but she moved slower in the mornings, and her appetite shifted toward the strangest things: molasses on cornbread, pickled carrots before dawn. He noticed, of course Sawyer noticed everything, but he didn't press. One evening, she placed his hand gently against her belly, where change had begun, slow and certain. "We're building what comes next," she said. He didn't speak, just held his hand there, eyes closed, like he could already feel the heartbeat underneath his palm. The ranch held quiet through that spring, days marked not by hardship, but by rhythm, fence mending, new calves, the hush of wind through young grass. Faye painted the cradle pale blue and lined it with muslin she stitched by lamplight. Sawyer added shelves to the pantry, reinforced the porch beams, and cleared the trail to the bluff so she could walk it without stumbling. He never once looked at her limp with pity, only ever saw the way she moved forward, one step after another, without complaint. One morning, as the sun rose gold and full over the ridge, she found him sitting with a ledger in his lap. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep." She sat beside him, pulling her shawl tight. "What's on your mind?" He turned the page before answering. "I was thinking how everything I used to chase never gave me anything that lasted. But this," he looked at her, eyes soft, "this is what holds." She traced the edge of the ledger with her finger. "Then we hold it. Together." And they did. Through the long days and short nights, through the hush of snowfall and the hum of bees in spring, they held. Not in grand ways, but in the quiet ones, in shared glances across the table, in the scrape of boots beside one another on the porch, in the steady rhythm of two people walking side by side toward a life carved clean from the land. And when the child came, wailing and strong with fists curled tight, Faye cried not from pain, not even from joy, but from the feeling of being whole, finally, in a world that had once told her she never would be. Sawyer wrapped the child in a soft quilt and placed him in her arms. "He's got your eyes," she whispered. "He'll have your courage," he answered. Outside, the wind stirred the grass. Inside, the fire crackled steady. And everything that came before was just the road to here. The baby was named Elias, after the quiet man who had once handed Sawyer a rifle and a reason to stay on his feet during a hard winter. It was Faye's idea. She said it softly one morning as Sawyer held the boy in the crook of his arm, his massive hand nearly spanning the child's back. Elias the elder had nodded once when they told him, then returned to mending a harness without speaking. But the next day, he left a carved wooden rattle on their porch rail. No note, just cedar, smooth as river stone. The weeks that followed were filled with new rhythms, feeding, rocking, shifting chores. Faye moved slower, her body still healing, but she didn't rest long. She tied the baby to her chest with a worn shawl and returned to the yard, pointing out which herbs grew best in shade so Sawyer could transplant them closer to the house. He listened carefully, furrow in his brow. He didn't like to get things wrong when it came to her. One crisp morning in late autumn, with frost still curling the edges of the grass, Sawyer came in from the barn holding a pigeon with a broken wing. "Found him near the haystack," he said, kneeling by the hearth. That gave Theo a fright. Faye looked up from where she was bundling linens. "He'll die if the wing sets wrong." "You know how to fix it?" "I know how to try." She wrapped the bird gently, her fingers deft around the fragile bone. Sawyer watched her in silence. The fire popped behind them as the baby stirred in his cradle. "You ever think you'd be this kind of woman?" he asked after a pause. Her hands didn't stop moving.
"No."
"But I think I always could have been. Nobody ever let me long enough to find out." He nodded, then reached over to steady the cloth she was tying. "You're more than I ever thought I'd get. You're only saying that because I haven't yet told you how many chickens I plan to keep come spring." He laughed then, a low, warm sound that made the baby kick in his sleep. By December, the mornings were white and still, the snow lying thick across the pastures. They kept the stove going dawn to dusk, and Sawyer insulated the windows with old flour sacks. Faye started reading aloud in the evenings, her voice soft as she cradled Elias in the crook of her arm. Sawyer sat nearby, sometimes whittling, sometimes just watching her lips move. One night, After she finished a page from a worn volume of Emerson's essays, she closed the book and looked toward him. "What did you think your life would look like?" she asked. He rubbed a thumb along the grain of the chair arm. "I figured I'd die young, or drift long enough to forget what I was missing. I didn't think I'd sit by a lamp and listen to my wife talk about self-reliance." She tilted her head. "You never told me much about before." "Not much to tell." "Tell me anyway." He leaned back, letting the firelight stretch across his boots. "My mother died when I was young. Father drank more after that. We moved a lot, mining camps, cattle drives, one winter with a preacher who thought he could scare the sin out of me. I left at 15 and never went back." Faye didn't speak right away. "You ever think about him? Your father?" "Sometimes. When I see the way I hold Elias and realize how different it feels." She looked down at their son, his tiny hands curled tight in sleep. "You're not him." "No," Sawyer said. "But I think I needed him to be who I am now." Wind howled outside and the house creaked, but inside was warm and still. In early January, Theo announced he'd be leaving come spring. He'd been offered a place further south where he could trade his fiddle for a steady wage and a roof of his own. Faye baked cornbread that night and folded a bit of sugar into the top crust. "You'll be missed," she told him as they sat around the table. He grinned. "Won't be the same without your boy hollering at sunup." "He's got lungs," Sawyer said, shaking his head fondly. Theo tapped a finger against the tabletop. "You 2V got something most folks never find. Doesn't matter if I'm here or gone. That kind of thing, it doesn't break easy." After he left, the ranch felt quieter. Faye began humming while she worked, soft tunes with no name, and Sawyer started carving a second cradle, this one smaller just for dolls. When she asked him why, he shrugged. "Might be more than one someday." She didn't answer, but that night she rested her hand on his chest just before sleep and whispered, "I'd like that." The days lengthened slowly, but each morning brought a little more light. Faye began walking the bluff trail again, Elias bundled in a sling across her chest. Sawyer joined her when he could, carrying a rifle slung over one shoulder, his other hand always ready if she stumbled. But she didn't. One afternoon, standing at the edge of the ridge, she turned to him. "I used to think the world narrowed with every step I took. Now I see it's just the path that was waiting for me all along." He looked out across the valley, toward the place where the creek split and the cottonwoods stood bare and tall. "I think you were always meant to find your way here." She took his hand, her fingers calloused and warm. "And I think you were always meant to wait." Neither spoke after that, not until the sun dipped low behind the ridgeline and the child stirred, blinking up at the sky like he already knew it all belonged to him. They walked back slowly, together, the snow soft beneath their boots, the house ahead glowing with firelight. And behind them, nothing worth looking back on. Only forward toward fields that would thaw, toward a garden that would rise again, toward the years waiting to be lived. The following summer ripened slow and gold, and the wind took on a softer edge. The snowmelt had long since disappeared into the thirsty soil, and the grass in the western pasture rose nearly to the stirrups. Faye had taken to rising just before first light, slipping from bed while the house still held the hush of night. She'd boil water, steep dried yarrow with mint from the garden, and cradle the cup in both hands as she watched the first birds stir along the fence line. Sawyer had noticed her gaze drifting more and more toward the eastern hills when she sat quiet. One morning, as they walked the trail above the creek, he asked what she was thinking. She glanced down at Elias, strapped snug against her chest, then up toward the horizon. "There's a spot up past the cottonwoods where the soil's darker. I think it'd hold squash well. Closer to the sun. Might be worth clearing." He nodded, tucking that small request into his mind the way he always did when she spoke of something she wanted. A week later, he borrowed Elias for a few hours and left her a note on the table, a pressed sprig of chokecherry pinned beneath it. By the time she reached the bluff, he cleared the brush and turned the soil with the short-handled plow she favored. He stood there, sleeves rolled, sweat on his temples, and pointed to the shaded edge. Figured you might want to plant something for color too. That corner keeps cool. She didn't say anything, just reached for his hand and held it for a long time, dirt and callus and all. That evening, as crickets tuned the dusk and Elias slept, she brought out a worn cloth bundle from beneath the bed. Inside were seeds she'd carried from place to place since she was 13, crooked-neck squash, blue lake beans, and a handful of dried marigold heads wrapped in muslin. "I saved these for something good," she said, laying them out on the table. Sawyer studied them closely. "They'll do well. They've waited long enough."
So had she.
In late August, a letter arrived from the county clerk in Missoula, addressed to Sawyer but bearing Faye's name in its folds. Her aunt had passed, the paper said, of fever.
No surviving.
No estate. Only a small parcel of land left unclaimed on the edge of town. Faye read the letter twice, then folded it carefully, setting it between the pages of a book she rarely touched. "I don't feel much," she said later, as Sawyer brushed out the horses. "Is that wrong?"
"No," he said.
"Sometimes we mourn the chances we never had more than the people." She leaned against the stall, arms crossed. "I don't think I'll go." "You don't have to. I'd rather plant marigolds." They never spoke of the letter again. It stayed tucked away, quiet and flat, just like the life she'd left behind. When the first frost came in September, Faye wrapped Elias in a wool shawl and carried him out to see his father mend the final stretch of fence before winter. The boy, now toddling, reached out for the post hammer and laughed when Sawyer let him touch the smooth handle. "He's strong," Faye said, brushing straw from her skirt. "Too strong," Sawyer muttered, rubbing his shoulder. "He'll need a pen name if he ever writes poetry." Sawyer raised an eyebrow. "You planning on raising a poet?" "Maybe. Or a blacksmith. Or a man who knows how to listen." "He'll have that. He's watching us." That night, she stitched a new lining into Sawyer's coat while he sanded the cradle rails smoother for Elias's next sibling. They hadn't spoken the word aloud, but it hung between them, soft and certain. In October, they hosted supper for 2 neighboring families whose barn roof had collapsed in a windstorm. Faye cooked for 12, her apron damp and her cheeks flushed. Sawyer brought out the bench he'd built the first year they'd met, and they all sat beneath the eave, passing bread and stew. Later, after the dishes had been scrubbed and the lantern dimmed, Sawyer found her standing beside the cradle. "Think we'll outgrow this house?" she asked. "I could build another," he said. "Or add a room." She turned toward him. "I don't want more space for things. I want space for people." He stepped closer. "We'll fill it slow." "Right." She nodded, resting her head against his chest. "I never thought I'd be someone who wanted more. But I do. With you." His voice was quiet. "Then we'll have it." The winter passed without grief. There were colds and one stubborn infection in Elias's ear, but they weathered it together. Faye taught him to clap to the rhythm of her humming, and Sawyer carved him a horse with a crooked tail. They hung it above the hearth. By spring, Faye's belly had begun to round again, and Sawyer reinforced the stable door to keep out the mountain wind. Elias learned to feed the hens, though more grain ended on the ground than in the trough. One morning, Sawyer brought back a handful of wild plum blossoms and set them on the table beside her tea. "They were blooming near the trail," he said. "Figured you'd want to see them before the wind took them off." She touched the petals gently. "They're the same color as the marigolds when they open in the sun." "I thought so, too." She looked up at him then, eyes soft. "I used to wonder if I'd always be the girl whose steps were uneven. Now I know I'm the woman who walks steady beside someone who never once asked me to be different." He took her hand, rough and warm. "And I'm the man who thanks God every morning that you didn't give up before I found you." They stood like that for a long while, the fire crackling low, the babies stirring in the next room, the wind outside full of new green and promise. Years passed, but no joy dulled. Faye taught Elias to read beneath the cottonwood tree, where she once planted beans. Sawyer built a second cradle, and then a third. Their children grew strong, each one carried in the sling she had sewn herself, each one raised with hands that had once been called broken. They never left the ranch, never needed to. They grew older with the land, with the same steadiness that had always marked their love quiet, rooted, and true. And every evening, no matter how long the day or how weary the bones, Sawyer always found her hand, and she always gave it. And when they sat on the porch in the golden hush of late summer, watching their children run through the tall grass, Faye leaned into him and whispered, "This was the life I never dared ask for." He kissed her temple, the same way he had on the day she said yes and replied, "It's the only one I ever wanted."